we go. That's what we want to be able to see. Well, it's the top of the hour. Thank you for joining us here at Security Title Talks. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on Thursday, September 17th for our first Security Title Talks presentation titled Ron is Here. My name is Anshi Lee, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Security Title Guarantee Corporation of Baltimore. I will be the moderator for this presentation. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. For audience members, you are in listen-only mode, but feel free to ask any questions and comments through the questions and chat boxes respectively. We will have a question and answer section at the end to address any lingering thoughts. A reminder for those who are seeking Maryland continuing education credit, you must keep your focus on the webinar as well as participate in the polls throughout this presentation. Today, we're featuring the CEO and President of Community Title Network, LLC, Michael Ridgway. Mr. Ridgway has decades of experience in the title industry and has been a recognized leader for leveraging technology to bring improvements to processes as well as customer service. In addition, we have the Division Administrator for the Charities and Legal Services Division of the Maryland Office of the Secretary of State, Michael Schlein. Hopefully I got everything. That's a long title there. Mr. Schlein oversees the day-to-day activities of the division, has been integral to the promulgation of rules and regulations for Ron. Gentlemen, on behalf of everyone here at Security Title, thank you for carving out some time in your busy schedules and joining us today to discuss Ron.
Great, thank you.
Without further ado, let's kick this off with Michael Ridgway to bring us into the future.
Great, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Some of you may have been part of the Security Title presentations that we've done on Ron over the course of the years. If you can go to next slide, please, Anshi. What we'd like to cover today, because we're getting so close to the launch under the legislation that we've been waiting for. It goes into effect, as everyone might know, October 1st, 2020. I'm going to go through some high-level stuff today, but we have Michael Schlein here from the Secretary of State's office, and that's where the meat of the matter is today, is what we need to expect and understand for when this law goes into effect from the regulations that they've promulgated. But today, we don't know the level of the exposure to this that people have on the call today, so bear with us if you know a little bit about this. We're going to go through a little bit of e-closing, understanding that. Certainly going to learn about remote online notarizations, or RON, which is the term. We're going to learn how to prepare for conducting RONs and what the RON experience looks like a little bit for your client. I want to talk a little bit about lender expectations and what's going on with the landscape for lenders. It's changing rapidly. And then, of course, we'll turn it over to Mike and the implementation of what's going on with the Secretary of State for Maryland. Next slide, please, Anshi. So understand that a lot has happened. It says over the last 90 days, a lot has happened over the last 6 months. If you understand, you know our business, you know that we are a compilation of 4 very disparate industries: state and local government. The title underwriters have their own world, the lenders have their own world, and we have our own world. We all have to come together to effect a closing. Well, when COVID hit, and we're all paper the requirement, right? All 4 of us really advanced very quickly. The state and local governments were tremendous. The circuit courts stepped up. The clerk of the court stepped up in Maryland to be able to do more electronic closing, allow more electronic recordings, and the underwriters stepped up with their exceptions. And the title attorneys and title agents, we adopted on how we were able to do closings. The lenders adopted as well, except they haven't yet come as far as the industry would like to see them. They're still in pretty much a paper world from the perspective of their investors. That is changing on a daily basis by leaps and bounds. That's all going on behind the scenes while we're in this busy production cycle that we're dealing with. But the Fannie Mae has said that they will go ahead, and that they know that this is the future, and they want their future to be RON closings. Next slide, on. So before we get into RON closings, let's just understand some of the terminology and e-closings. And an e-closing is signing a portion or all of the documents with the lender through electronic format. And there are a number of different electronic formats that a lender can allow. One is the hybrid closing, and that's probably the one that you've been hearing about the most. The hybrid closing is where some documents are signed electronically, some documents are signed in wet signature, particularly the note, the deed of trust, any other forms that the lender requires, and that requires an in-person closing typically, or some dealing with paper in some way, shape, or form. There's the next level of that, which with the establishment of MERS about 20, 25 years ago, the Mortgage Electronic Registry System, that allowed for the registration of, and signatures of notes called e-notes. It's an electronic signature. It is a whole body of law that is separate and distinct from a wet note that's signed. There's different laws around it. There's different processes. There's different requirements where the lenders have to have e-vault. So it's not just that we can take a note and have it signed electronically if the lender's not set up in the e-note environment. There's a fully digital signature. It still requires an in-person signature. It's typically someone is showing up at closing with a pad and the borrower is signing the documents electronically, but it still requires an in-person notarization. And then finally, the remote or virtual notarization, which is where everything is done, where the notary is in fact remote, not in the physical presence as we know it traditionally in our business. So that is the background of the 4 types of closings. Next slide, please, Archie. So what is RON? We're going to talk about what is RON, but let's understand what, there's a lot of confusion in the market about this. Let's understand what RON is not from a legal perspective. And we can't stress this enough, and certainly Michael Schlein and the Secretary of State can't stress this enough. It is not getting on a Skype session or any of those other types of facilities. FaceTime, Google Hangouts, GoToMeeting, Zoom, and conducting a closing. There is special technology that is required, and in our modernization of our notary laws, what it did is it constituted a redefinition to include physical presence as allowing physical presence by the use of special interactive video and audio connection. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. In addition to the technology that's required, some of the pieces of that are there has to be a special identification process. And it's been mandated in the model legislation that we have adopted a lot of, but we've gone beyond that and modernized our entire notary laws around this new statute. There is a requirement for video, and there's a requirement that has to be recorded, and the recording of the documents have to be tamper-proof. You know, that's a lot different than just doing a Skype session or a FaceTime session. So that's where the rubber meets the road. There's other aspects of that, but that's where the true distinction comes to be. And if you look at it and you've ever experienced a RON closing, it pretty much is like once you get past those special features, it is very similar to the process in a live signing, except the utilization of the electronic signature. Next slide, please. To give you an idea of the landscape of where we are in the country, and it's a kaleidoscope right now. And these different colors represent the different progress that states have made. We're going to focus on Maryland. Maryland is in gold, and those are denoted. Those states in gold indicate that the governor emergency order allowed RON. The blue states are where states have enacted RON laws and their rules. October 1st, we go from gold to blue, so we will be part of the majority of now of the states. And the red states are those that have passed the laws for RON, but not the regulations. Okay, so you can see that most of the country has done this, and the reason that some of the lenders have not gotten to where they need to get to is because, as typical in real estate, all real estate is local, right? By local laws, and they still are dealing with the kaleidoscope from their perspective. But we're getting closer to that. Next slide, please, Anshi. So let's go through some of the details around. I'm going to deal with this at a really high level, and then Michael's going to get into some more of the detail. So let's talk about the technology. As we talked about, there is a special technology. Understand, the technology has really only been around for about 3 to 4 or 5 years. The first RON law was passed in the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, in 2012. The technology didn't even exist then, and so those laws really just sat there. The second state was Montana, 3 years later than that, and then since then, really since about 2017, 18, that's where we've seen that map that we just saw. There's been a big change across the country because the technology has been developed to the point where it's useful, and the legislators have felt comfortable with the infrastructure around it. So there are signer requirements. Basically, the signer has to be a person that's a citizen of the United States or a resident, a permanent resident of the United States through documentation. That is a requirement that we get that information. The person can be anywhere in the world, but they do have to be a resident of the United States to do this. The identification process is something that's really cool. It looks like out of sci-fi. One, there's a authentication process where if you've ever gone onto a particular site and had to answer 3 or 4 questions that look like they come from your credit report, that's the first level that these vendors have to go through. And once you reach that, the signer reaches that level, then they come onto the screen, and then they have to go through the actual presentation of their identification, their government issued photo ID. And it's, at least the technology we use is pretty cool. They hold it right up to the screen. The screen takes a picture of it, and these groups have the ability to determine whether that driver's license, for instance, is real or not, because they have access to all these databases and they can tell whether it's phony or not, which is way above my pay grade as a notary. I can't tell what a California driver's license looks like at all. Much, you know, certainly can tell in Maryland, but I couldn't tell if it was real or not. So the fraud prevention is much better potentially in these situations. There needs to be audio and video interaction. Some of the technologies require certain size screens to make sure that people can see what they're signing. If any of you have ever used DocuSign in your practice, you do know that sometimes people won't read or can't see things, but they sign it anyway, and it becomes problematic. We just had a case like that last week where someone signed something that had wrong information in it, that the realtors were sending back and forth. It has to be recorded. The entire session has to be recorded, including my understanding, Michael, you can clarify on this when you have the when you go through your regulations. The person who is the signer needs to acknowledge during that video session that they are doing this voluntarily. And Michael talked a little bit about having the environment around making sure, showing the environment around making sure that there's no undue influence on that person, that a notary who has physical presence in a room can attest to. We have to make sure of that. There is a special digital notarial seal that each video remote notary has to get for them to affix. They coordinate that with their RON portal, is my understanding. And then certainly there's a script that a lot of these RON portals will use to make sure that the signature, the signer is doing this voluntarily and has the capacity, which are the 2 big things that we have to do as a notary. Next slide, please, Anshul. Okay. Just this is, I want to give you an idea if you haven't had any exposure to the industry leaders. Some title underwriters have specific approved vendors. This is not all inclusive. These slides were done back at the beginning when we had some industry leaders. And Michael and I were just talking that there's now about 12 to 13 vendors that are out there in the marketplace. The ones who were sort of new to the game, early to the game, were Notarize, NotaryCam, Nexus, Pavaso, DocVerify. There are others out there that are implementing this. NAR did invest in Notarize. We feel that they're the gold standard, but that's a personal opinion. We work with a couple of other ones. We know Pavaso is very good. We know DocVerify has been strong lately. They're all good, right? They all do the job that we need to do. I just know that Notarize, NAR invested in them, and so that was pretty remarkable. Remember, these are not Skype sessions. You have to use one of the RON portals, and the state is going through an approval process with them right now. Michael will speak to more of that when we get closer. Next slide, please, Anshul.
Oh, Mike, if I can interject right here. I did notice that you had mentioned up on the top that title underwriters may have specific approved vendors.
Yeah.
I can't speak for all underwriters, but I can speak a little bit on behalf of Security Title. I do know that we will be issuing an updated bulletin for Maryland in either today or before the end of the week with some guidelines. Now, while I don't believe we will be naming any specific vendors, pros or cons or things like that, we do want to make sure that we have some of the guidelines that are also in the rules and regulations out there for our title agents to adhere to and be aware of, but also be able to provide them with some guidelines in terms of how to vet these RON vendors as well. I personally have, with the exception of .verify, have vetted all 4 of those Notarize, NotaryCam, Nexus, and Pavaso. I personally have used Nexus for a transaction on my own for a sale of my previous home in Wisconsin. So I'm familiar with them as well. But we want to make sure that we are empowering our title agents to be able to understand the new ecosystem of RON and how to decide for themselves, what approved vendors work best for their workflow and their business model. So sorry about that.
No, great. Thank you for that input. Appreciate that. Next slide, please. So there, in addition to what the law sets out from the use of the technology and what the technology needs to bring to the closing, there are additional conditions that we need to think about and make sure that we adhere to. Understand that the law is set out that any notary that's used by us, even right now during the government's orders, and certainly once we get to when the legislation becomes effective, and includes Maryland notaries, the notary that is providing the service needs to physically be located in the state or the jurisdiction that they are approved by at the time of the remote notarization. So I can't be a Maryland notary and happen to be on vacation in Florida and sit on the beach and do a couple closings down there. That's not going to fly. If I happen to be a notary in Florida, then I could, that would work. But please understand that you have to be physically located in the state. Understand also that when the UATA laws were passed back in the 2000s to be the foundation of the Uniform Electronic Transaction Act laws that Maryland has passed, that there's always been the ability for someone, the consumer, the signer in this case, not to be required to do something electronically. If they want to rely on paper, they can. And these portals do have processes to allow that to occur somewhat through their systems, is my understanding. But understand that you cannot force anyone to go through this process electronically. If they will still want to use paper and to do a closing and execute with a wet signature, they're allowed. The next slide, please, Nancy. Okay. One other last thing before we talk about this. Understand that another requirement in Maryland is a Maryland licensed title producer has to be a participant in that closing. I let Michael go a little bit more on that. I know he's more Secretary of State and it's more of an insurance issue, but understand that the MIA requires that as well, that you just can't say, okay, I'm the licensed title agent, I have to run to another closing. I'm going to let my so-and-so in the office do this closing. You still have the obligation from your insurance licensing requirements to be participating in the closing. So let's understand, we had all this happen. It was a tidal wave that hit us, obviously, back in March. And RON portals are sort of a new dynamic. And certainly they are in Maryland. Virginia might have been using them for a couple of years. But because we had this big tidal flow of people trying to rush, the remote online notarization vendors, they weren't ready for this. They were moving their business forward, but they got swamped. They couldn't take everybody on now. All of them are getting much better at this. There's more providers that are in the market, but understand that there has been a significant backlog. If you haven't had the opportunity to connect with a vendor yet or get as part of the registration process, please try again. They are getting better and better each and every week, but that is important. So just understand that also we have, there have been other ways because the state legislators and governors in their emergency orders recognized that we had this log jam and that it limited access, that there were other ways to allow us to do closings, the limited power of attorneys, the RINs, the remote ink, notarizations, those processes. Fannie Mae has said their gold standard is going with the remote online notarization. That's where they wanted to go. They might, and that those other ones are second and third, and a distant second and third. I'm sure Mike will have some comments on that about how the Secretary of State may handle those going forward and what the timeframes are all on those. I know that's a work in progress, but understand that now that the law is here, everyone is pushing towards the remote online notarization, and some of these other ways to close loans are going to dissipate and fall off the opportunity shelf. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm racing through this because Michael's the star of the show today. Because we got a lot to go over in anticipation of what we need to do next. But understand, there's been great advances in the last 6 to 8 months of what has happened, how everyone has come together. Montgomery County went to electronic recording. Baltimore City's in the process of trying to get that done. That's happening more and more across the state, across all of our region. Fannie Mae has publicly said, we are supporting Ron and we are driving this as much as possible. The secondary market is getting better. Ginnie Mae is accepting these now. We can do hybrids even with a wet note being signed, and understand that the secondary market is getting better, and that's where they're going. Next frontier on all of this is a fully electronic closing, and we're going to see this happening in leaps and bounds. And my message to anybody who has not yet had a chance to do this, and I know we are all crazy busy and we don't have hardly any time to do anything else, we get that, but I would really suggest to you to invest in this, the processes and the technologies. It's not expensive at all, but invest the time and the training of your staff to do this. We have done significant number of runs in throughout our company in all the jurisdictions that we do business with. And I will tell you, it's getting better and better, and it's becoming more accepted. And the lenders are accepting these in leaps and bounds, and they ultimately want to get there. It's way more of an efficient process. In our webinars that we've done in our company with realtors over the course of time, I will tell you close to 90% have said they want to use a title company that provides this service. So understand that this is what the agents want, even the older agents who we think may not want to teach new tricks, be taught new tricks. Everyone wants to use, and it's not just related to COVID, it's convenience. People don't want to drive through traffic or have to go across town. They want to be able to close in their office, not come to your office. So understand there's a huge driving consumer demand for this, just like we have those desires in our world as consumers. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael, and he's going to take us through where we're going next. So I guess we
Perfect.
have a
Sorry to interject. I didn't want to come in on you there, but yes, we do have, for the audience, we do have our first poll. I will be launching it momentarily, and we'll give the audience a few moments just to respond. But thank you so much for that there. I think it's, while the individual Ron and the process are important, it's great to keep a track on the whole ecosystem, as I like to say. All the trends in our industry, not just on the title side, but also the lender side, and also from Fannie and Freddie. So yeah, poll one question: do you plan on performing Ron closings in October? And no, it is not a trick question. We'll give the audience a few more seconds to respond. It looks like the majority have already responded. Alrighty, and I'm going to close this poll now. Alrighty, so looking at the responses here, or the responses there, it looks like we had a mixed bag, and that's completely fine. It all depends on your priorities and where you are set, and also how you predict the recent future. But I'm glad to see that it's kind of a mixed bag throughout the board, that there are some that are saying yes right away, and some that are just simply not planning on it for their reasons as well. You know, again, the trend is hopefully that we will be going back to, we will be accelerating Ron as we progress, and hopefully that will be the next steps. Alrighty. Let me go ahead and close out here. There we go. All right. At this point, we'll switch gears and hear from Michael Schlein for more of the details on upcoming changes in the industry will experience with the new RON law effective October 1st. Without further ado, Michael, feel free to take it away.
Hey, thanks for having me this morning. Thanks, Mike, as well. Setting a high bar there, so I'll try not to disappoint. I guess I'll go to the next slide and get this started. So there's a lot of changes to the notary law that take effect on October 1st. Not just the legalization of remote notarizations, but as Mike kind of mentioned, there's the law that kind of the uniform law that sets the standards, revised uniform law notarial acts. Maryland essentially adopted that into its own law, and inserted most of it, not everything, and kept some of the Maryland specific things with regards to how you become a notary in that process. But in general, how you act as a notary is very different in the eyes of the law. Biggest high-level changes before I dive into RON specifically, record-keeping requirements. One of my favorite things, and I say that in complete sarcasm, about the old law was the record-keeping requirements. It just said you had to keep a register. Didn't tell you what, didn't tell you how long, didn't tell you in any format it had to be, just said keep one. This law definitely, I think in my mind, corrects that by setting a specific list of things that are required to be kept in your records for every notarization. And it also sets out standards for keeping the record, whether it's electronic or on paper. Identification and competency. The old law just said satisfactorily identify your signer. What does that even mean? The new law sets specific standards for identifying signers, which is generally what notaries have been using in practice, but still it's always nice to have a standard to follow. And another thing this law does with regards to competency is the notary always had this right, but it codifies it, which is to say no when somebody appears under duress or not competent. So it's good to have that backing. I won't, but I could share some fun stories of the old days when I handled notary complaints when I first started here, and some of the complaints people made, and you wouldn't believe some of the things people would complain about. But a notary would deny something over competency or question of competency, and there wasn't really anything in the law that said they could, but we would still pat them on the back and say good job anyway. Types of notarial acts. In the old law, there's really only 3 types of acts. You can do an oath or affirmation, you can do an acknowledgement, and then the third kind is official witness. And in the new law, notary as official witness is kind of by the wayside, at least in the way you used to do it. They also allow certain records of documents to be certified, which of course under the current law that will expire on September 30th. The new law will take effect 10/1. Under the new law, you can certify certain documents. Under the old law, you couldn't. This law also will create a measure to allow electronic records to be turned into tangible records, so a paper copy, and certified as a true copy of the electronic record. So there's a few different things notaries can do. And then the next one, requirement of notarial certificates on every notarization. Now, if you're doing closings, the last time I did a closing, every notarization I did, there was a certificate, whether it was a affirmation or an acknowledgement, where I was swearing to something or I was acknowledging that something constituted my act and deed. So for the most part, things you're doing in title work, the certificate's already affixed to the document, to the record. So it may not necessarily change what you're doing in your profession on a regular day-to-day level, but for your regular run-of-the-mill notary that may not be doing title insurance producing, when they get a request for notarization and there's no certificate on there, they're going to have to know what to affix to that document to indicate that they completed a notarial act. And then, of course, the big one, why we're all here today, is the legalization of remote notarial acts, which we're going to talk about in more detail. Next slide, please. So the title, big exclamation point, remote notarization is now legal by law, well, effective October 1. So the law is effective. It'll permit notarial acts to be performed remotely with two exceptions, wills and trust instruments as defined in those various sections of the law. Otherwise, remote notarizations are fair game. So, you know, anything. Now, most of these RON systems, I think, are set up more for your industry. They're set up for land, title, that type of stuff. They're not set up to notarize a copy of a school record or something like that. But you know, I'm sure there are some out there that can do that, and if not, there will be soon enough when it's lucrative enough to do that. Next slide. So of course, you know, this incoming law versus what's temporarily allowed. Everybody knows this. You know, Mike kind of talked about a little bit. You know, we had this emergency order. We have this pandemic. It hit us pretty hard. Stay away, social distance, but it doesn't mean people don't need things notarized. So the governor had issued a temporary order allowing remote notarizations back on March 30th. I mean, really, you think about it, we had this law that took effect October 1st. There was no way to make that happen faster without an act of the legislature, which had since dispersed because, you know, there's a pandemic. They rushed through that session, got everything they had to do done, and got out of town. So we couldn't artificially move up the start date of the law. So we had to have a temporary order to allow remote notarizations in this pandemic, at least until such time that the new law took effect. So we have this gap we had to close. That's why the remote order, the temporary allow this stuff went through. Sorry, my light just clicked off. Apparently I haven't moved enough. The temporary order was pretty generic, vague. It didn't give a lot of detail, just, you know, covered the very basics of what is a remote notarization. Now, because of that, it allowed the wet signature, the RIN notarization. And as Mike pointed out, RON is not Skype and Teams and all those other ones. They're actual purpose-driven platforms, purpose-designed platforms, not a video conferencing tool where there's wet signatures. And you know, we kind of had to allow that because you get this order allowing RON, but the backlog for people signing up on a RON vendor was 30, 60, 90 days. The whole country was trying to find a RON vendor, and there just wasn't enough people working to get everybody logged on and using the system. So it had this backlog. So we thought, okay, wet signature remote notarizations, here we go. But of course, that was only ever meant as a temporary measure. The new law, of course, doesn't allow for these tools, these video conferencing tools to be used. There's a few things in the law that make it very clear that RIN was never the intention of this law. RON was always the intention of the law. You know, notarial certificates required for every act, journal entries required for every act have to be made contemporaneously with the act. They can't be completed or accomplished contemporaneously with a notarial act if you're using a video conferencing platform, because you have to get off the video and email it, mail it, fax it to somebody else who's probably not on video when they get it, and then they have to affix their seal. Who really knows it's even the same document? And there's some other items in section 18.223 that will, the incoming law we'll talk about with regards to credential analysis and identity proofing that Mike touched on a little bit there. We'll cover it in a little more detail, what it is exactly that your RON vendor will do that Skype is not doing for you to help you identify somebody satisfactorily and beyond a shadow of a doubt. So, and the other big thing is remote notarial acts require electronic signatures. If it's a wedding notarization, it's not an electronic signature. So, right there, at the very basic level of what RON includes. RIN is not RON. And, our plan here in the office is once we hit October 1st, we're going to go with the law. The law's there. We should follow the law. We'll kind of, the order was there. That doesn't mean the order is going to be rescinded. But the guidance from us will be follow the law. We won't have, there won't be a need for temporary guidance because there'll be a law in place to cover what is required for remote notarizations now, unlike before October 1st. So next slide, please. So the basics, remote notarization, just like any other notarization, you have to identify the person, right, that wants the notarial act completed. Personal knowledge, credible witness. I have a little star next to personal knowledge. I'll define that here shortly. Identification, credential analysis, and identity proofing. So usually if you're in person, you're just using the identification credential. I'm going to show you my driver's license, and you're going to look at it, look at me, and say, yep, that's you. Now, when you're doing remote notarization, you also have to, if you're using an identification credential, the signer needs to pass through that credential analysis and identity proofing process that Mike touched on, which again, we'll talk about in more detail. But if you don't know the person, you need to use an identification credential, and you need to go through credential analysis and identity proofing when conducting a remote notarization. And the other big thing, so the notary must reasonably confirm that a record before the notary is the same record in which the remotely located individual made a statement. What does that mean in plain English? If you are conducting a remote notarization, you're going to know and be able to reasonably confirm it's the same record because you're going to be looking at the same thing in the digital or virtual world. I'm going to watch you sign it, and you're going to watch me notarize it. And it's all going to happen in the virtual world electronically. Turn that down a little bit. Sorry, guys. Electronically, and you're going to know it's the same document. Another good reason why RIN is not RON. You can watch me sign something through video chat, but you don't really know when it shows up on your doorstep if that's actually the same thing that I signed. The notary public or person acting on their behalf, so in other words, the RON vendor, creates an audiovisual recording of the performance of the notarial act. The recording shall be retained for a period of at least 10 years after the recording is made. This is in line with the journal, the record keeping requirements. You got to keep your register, your record book for 10 years as well. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later when we talk about some regs that cover this, but there are, do you necessarily have to keep that yourself? No, the RON vendor can store it for you. You're not on the hook for having that in your possession at all times. You need to either have it or be able to obtain it from your RON vendor. If you and your RON vendor have an agreement about them keeping it and you accessing it, then that would meet the requirements of the law. Next slide, please. Next slide. There we are. Thanks. Sorry. There we go. Yep. For other remote notarization basics, continued. If the remotely located individual is outside the United States, the record must be one that relates to a matter within the jurisdiction of the United States. I'll shorthand that first point for you. And the notary has no knowledge that the act of making the statement or signing the record is prohibited by the foreign state in which the person is located. So right there, it tells you it really doesn't matter where the person signing this record is located. They could be anywhere in the world, as long as the documents relating to business within the U.S. and you, the notary public, don't actually know that it's violating a law elsewhere where this person's located. It does not mean, as Mike already pointed out, I'll reiterate, that the notary can be anywhere in the world. The notary has to be located in Maryland. And I emphasize that because if you're here, you probably know that, but I'm surprised at how many times people don't realize that, and we encounter that in our office. If you're a Maryland notary public, the only place in which you have jurisdiction to act is the state of Maryland. You can't drive, like Mike said, I go to vacation in Florida, I'm sitting on a beach. I'm not my Maryland Notary Public Seal is no good in Florida. I have to be located in Maryland because that's where my authority is granted, unless you're also a Florida notary, in which case you'd use your Florida notary seal. But if you're only a Maryland notary, you can't be traveling the world with your seal and doing remote notarizations. Where the signer is doesn't really matter, but the only place the notary has jurisdiction to operate as a Maryland notary is in Maryland. That would be like, the governor of Maryland passing laws and making them effective in Florida. That's not how it works. The governor of Maryland doesn't have authority to do that, nor does the Maryland Notary Public have the authority to exercise those powers in another state. And then the little star, personal knowledge, what does that mean? The law was kind enough to attempt to define it for us. You have personal knowledge of the identity of an individual personally appearing if the individual is personally known to the notarial officer through dealings sufficient to provide reasonable certainty that the individual has the identity claimed. What does that mean? We'll see. Do you know them or do you know them? There's a little wiggle room in that wording. And I would just say, common sense. If you're meeting a client and the only way you know your client is through them being your client and you just took them on and you're doing this closing, you don't know them. You may have identified them once previously, but you don't really know them. So through dealings sufficient to provide reasonable certainty that the individual has the identity claimed. So what does that mean exactly? But do you know it when you know somebody? Yeah, you know it. And you know what that means if you don't have reasonable certainty as well. So next slide, please. Certificates of Remote Notarial Act. I throw this on here because, every notarial act is going to require a certificate under the new law. Like I said earlier, most everything you notarize as a title insurance producer and notary regarding a closing already has a certificate. But if you're doing it remotely, now the certificate must indicate that the act involved a remotely located individual and was performed using communication technology. That's the exact wording. That's a cut and paste out of the law. So if you do a remote notarization, the certificate has to indicate that. It can't just be a regular certificate, otherwise it would be assumed that it was done in person. It has to indicate this particular action occurred. And the law gives you sample certificates. So if you're unsure, there are examples right in the law, cut and paste right out of that law. And you can cut and paste this wording about the remotely located individual for a notarial certificate as well, right out of the law. So you don't have to figure out how to write it. It's right there for you to take from the law. So the law provides a lot more detail, the incoming one does, than the current one does. So take advantage of that detail. If not already on the record being notarized, the notary public should affix one of the sample certificates. So I've talked about that a little already at the beginning. Like I said, there are sample certificates in the law. Use them. They don't have to match that exactly. But there are examples in there that when there is not a certificate, you can use those in the law that are needed and apply it. So take advantage of what's there. Must be executed contemporaneously with the performance of the Notarial Act. Again, drawing a huge distinction between RIN and RON. This is not RIN. This is not video conferencing, Skype and all that stuff. Great tools to get us through an emergency. But we have this law coming in here that does what the actual intent of remote notarizations is. Next slide, please. Credential analysis and identity proofing. What is credential analysis? In the law, it's defined as a process or service by which a third party confirms the validity of an identification credential by a review of public or private data sources. So in the law, in section 18.223, maybe I should have noted that on the slide, it goes into detail of what identity proofing is. Now, the Secretary of State is empowered in this law to create further rules or regulations about this. We have not done that in this point in time. So what is in the law with regards to identity proofing and credential analysis is what is required. There's no extra steps that we've thrown in there. This is a new law. This is not a totally new frontier, but still fairly new to everybody, you, the notary, and us, the regulator. So as life goes on, maybe we'll learn some things and we need to enhance some areas of this law with some regulations. But right now, identity proofing and credential analysis, no extra rules, shall be performed through identity proofing through a dynamic knowledge-based authentication that meets the following requirements. Do you need to know these all per se? No, I'm going to kind of go through them one by one. There's 8 of them. We'll try to go through them pretty quickly. If you got a good RON vendor, it's going to do this for you. But identity proofing, people have to answer questions like Mike said. If you go through a credit check or anything, you log on, you got to knowledge-based questions. When I sign on to my work stuff, I got to answer 3 questions every day. It drives me crazy. But otherwise, it'll lock me out. So even if on the work issued laptop, but each individual must answer a series of questions, 5 questions. They must have a minimum of 5 possible answers for those questions. The person has to get at least 80% correct. I guess you only need to know 80% of their self. So if you're not 100% sure yet who you are, it's okay, as long as you're 80% sure. Got bad jokes all day. All questions must be answered within 2 minutes. So there's a time limit. If the remotely located individual fails to answer in the first attempt, they must retake the quiz one time within 24 hours. During a retake, a minimum of 40% of the prior questions must be replaced. So you can't get the exact same 5. So theoretically here, if somebody is trying to hijack one's identity and they can't get them all right, they're not going to come back the next day and have the same 5 questions that they could research and answer to. At least 2 of those 5 are going to be changed. So it adds other layers of protection. If the person fails a second attempt, they can't do it for within 24 hours, so they have to wait even longer. The notary public must not be able to see or record the questions or answers. Why? It's personal information. We don't want the notary to have all that information. The notary needs to know that the person was able to answer that correctly. Credential analysis, what is that? Oh wait, I already gave you the definitions. So credential analysis, again, the RON vendor platform is going to take care of this. They have automated software processes to help the notary verify the identity. They got, you take the picture of your ID and they have software that, like Mike said, can really determine if that's a true ID. If you've ever, gone somewhere and somebody scanned your ID, there are tools that they have to ensure that happens. So there's technologies that confirm, the visual and physical and cryptographic security features on identification. They all have these little things on the ID that, you have to have certain tools to verify that are there. Without those little tricks and trades on the ID, it would be easier to forge. So this technology can track that. If you remember the old days, I guess not old days, they used to sell an ID book where you could get an ID or a copy of everybody, all the IDs in all 50 states. And some banks used to have them. I remember a fun story long ago when I was young and 21 and in Florida and Key West, trying to even get into an establishment, of just a regular bar on Duval Street. They broke out an ID book because they didn't believe I was 21. To have those days where people thought I was younger than that again. This technology does it, but does it electronically, and it's pretty cool technology. So your RON vendor is going to take care of this credential analysis and identity proofing. Can't use video conferencing to accomplish these. Skype doesn't do it for you, but these RON vendors will. Next slide. Record keeping for remote notarization. So there are a bunch of, like I said, record keeping requirements. The big ones specific to remote notarizations, that if you're doing remote notarizations, you need to have an electronic journal. of all your remote notarial acts. If you do both paper and remote or electronic, got to have a separate paper journal for those traditional notarial acts. So you're going to have, if you're doing remote notarizations, probably one or more. You're going to have at least one, obviously, and maybe more journals, because you can't really mix your remote electronic stuff with your paper stuff. And the law even throws another wrinkle in there: a notary public, guardian, conservator, or agent of a deceased notary shall retain the audiovisual recording created, calls them to. So basically, if something happens to you and you hopefully nothing bad happens, but if it does, this law makes somebody else keep it. I don't know how we're going to enforce that, but it makes it happen. So I thought that detail was very interesting. Time will tell how that goes, but that's one we're going to have to figure out. But the law makes it a requirement that this stuff has to be kept for 10 years, whether it's by you or by somebody else on your behalf if something happens to you. Notary public shall retain a journal. 18219 is the section of the law that talks about journal requirements, and any audiovisual recordings, which is covered in the 18214, the section that talks about remote notarizations. In a computer or other electronic storage device that protects the journal or audiovisual recordings against unauthorized access by password or cryptographic process. So, it sets a standard for how you have to keep this. If you got a RON vendor and you run all your stuff through them, and the video recordings are saved there, and your journal is, saved there, and you have a password or cryptographic process to access it, then you're good. But just like a regular paper journal, you don't want this thing out there unsecure. It has to be kept securely. There's personal information in your journal on other people. We don't want anybody to be able to hack or access that. Just like you shouldn't leave a paper journal laying around on your desk for anybody to see. So there are security standards in there for this journal that have to be met. Next slide, please. More record keeping. So you may engage by written contract a third party to act as a repository to provide the storage required. So do you have to keep all these recordings yourself? Nope, somebody else can do it for you. As long as you meet these terms, it shall enable the notary public to comply with the retention requirements. So in other words, you can't sign on to somebody that's only going to keep it for 5 years rather than 10. And if the contract's terminated, they have to give you your stuff for you to keep. They can't get rid of it by that agreement, and you would still be able to have it by any agreement that's allowed under law. I don't think I've had too many questions about that yet, but of course the concern is, what about what if I switch RON vendors? What happens? Well, you should get your stuff. And the law talks about the Secretary of State approving repositories. We haven't done that yet. I don't know if we ever intend to do that. We sure don't have money to get a warehouse to hold stuff and create extra bandwidth to hold everybody's records. But the law is nice enough to say that if you have a contract with somebody to hold your stuff, it's deemed a repository approved by us, even if we didn't actually approve it. I don't know that we have any intention of approving repositories or being one ourselves, but well, we don't have an intention of being one ourselves, but this contract itself, an agreement to hold your stuff, is deemed approved. Whether you don't even have to ask us to approve it, it's just deemed approved. It's deemed a repository. Next slide. Thank you. So obligations of a remote notary. This is some stuff here that is talked about in our proposed regulations. Obviously, if you're going to do remote notarizations, you have to be currently commissioned. There's not a separate commissioning to be a remote notary. How you do that, I'm going to cover last, because I think that's a part everybody wants to know, so I'll hit it last. So it's fresh in everyone's mind at the end. But you have to be currently commissioned and in good standing. You can't be suspended, you can't be revoked, you can't be expired. If you're not current, can't be a remote notary. So that's number one. You have to notify the Secretary of State in writing of the intent to perform. That's covered in the law. You have to identify the authorized remote online vendor or vendors that a remote notary would intend to use to perform remote notarial acts. We're going through a process now where we've reached out to our vendors to try to have them complete something. So we're going to create a list of authorized vendors to use under the new law in Maryland. It may look different from the list of vendors that's being temporarily allowed under the emergency. Because not every, we just kind of put together a list because we had to, there's this emergency order. Good luck, SOS. So we had to put together a list and figure it out, and we did. And so this list may not have as many people. It may have some different RON vendors that aren't currently on there that may want to get in on the action here in Maryland. But you're going to have to identify an authorized remote online notary vendor. Use technology that can make an audiovisual record of the entire physical location of the Notarial Act and all persons physically present for the remote Notarial Act. So this will tie into the next point, require all persons physically present with a remotely located individual to identify themselves and their role in the transaction. So what do those two mean? I want to clear up any maybe confusion on what we're actually asking of you. So when you use remote notary technology, remember we had a work group for 2 years that talked about this and different ideas that were ultimately put into this law when it was passed. And one thing that was always says, hey, when you do a remote notarization, you kind of scan the room, make sure there's nobody on the other side of the computer, forcing somebody to do something that they don't want to do. And when you're remotely located, it's not always as easy to detect that feeling of duress or undue influence that one might be imposing on someone else. If you're in person and there's a couple people there, you can sense it, you can feel it. You got little Johnny that wants grandma's inheritance, and he's kind of saying, Grandma, you got to do this. And, he's trying to be the one to communicate with you rather than the person actually wanting the notarial act. And, you can detect those things. Some of those signs are obvious, some of them are subtle, but you can tell. Some of that gets lost in translation when you're doing it remotely. But one way to ensure that is to just make sure that we know what's around you when you're there. And the other thing about everybody identifying themselves, if you're out, if you're in the food court at the mall doing this, I don't expect you to go interview everybody at a table and identify them. That's not what that means. We're talking about your immediate party that's there with you. And again, that's another hopeful deterrent about undue influence. If we learned anything about notary complaints, or from notary complaints, it's that when some of these sad situations arise, there was somebody that was there that was maybe exerting some influence or helping to perpetrate an act that shouldn't have been done. And but there's never really a record because the notary doesn't have to have a record of any of that. They just need to, in the current law, keep a record of, a register of the people that signed before them. So this will have a video record of it because everybody loves to claim that they didn't do something, but they did it. And if it's on camera, it's pretty obvious. So again, we're not asking you to interview everybody if you're out in a public place. That's not what we want. Just a quick, if it's my wife and I'm notarized, I'm signing something, she's with me. Hey, that's so-and-so. And, that way we have a record of everybody that was there with the signer so that there's no question if there ever is a question later, who was there, who did what and why. There's a good video record of it. And that's not just for the signer's protection, but that's for the notary's protection as well. One other thing we've learned over time from notary complaints, it doesn't matter how right the notary was and what they did, somebody still might complain later and try to get out of something they agreed to. So this is not just a signer protection, but this is a notary protection as well. We care about you, the notary, not just the public, but you, the notary. We care about everybody, the integrity of the entire process. So this will help you as well in the future should there ever be a question, and hopefully there won't be. but sometimes it happens, and sometimes it happens years later. You would have no way of remembering without having that record and that recording if it's remote. So this helps a lot. Next slide, please. Just more continued obligations. Charge no more than the allowed fee for an original notarial act. Still $4. Remote notaries allowed cost more than $4 per transaction. And it's funny, the original bill that passed would have raised the fee to $25, but in the bill's final version, somehow that allowed notary fee stayed at $4. So anybody that's is asking why, I don't know. I'm not a legislator. I didn't keep it the way it was. So it creates a little bit of an issue where you have the technology costs more than $4 a transaction, but you can only charge $4 a transaction. Now, if you're doing a closing, you know, what do I remember from a closing? It was several $100s for the settlement. So, you know, if you can only charge me $4 for the notarization, excuse me, you know, there's a greater settlement fee that'll probably help eat some of the cost of remote notarizations. But for regular notaries, excuse me, I'll take a sip of water real quick. For your regular notary that's not a title insurance producer and doing settlements where they're collecting another fee above and beyond for another service that's not the notarization, but you know, their profession or your profession, like a title insurance producer, $4, not a big deal. But your regular notary who's just out there notarizing stuff, if they were to try to use a RON vendor, it would be a money losing proposition for them, because they can only charge $4 and they're only notarizing a document, but it costs more than $4 to do the remote notarial act. So, you know, maybe that'll get changed. That'll require a legislative fix. That's not one that we can fix ourselves or change ourselves. The law allows a maximum. We can set a fee by regulation, but it can be no more than $4. So until that is increased in the law, we can't increase it by regulation. Again, obligations, we added it to the regs again, even though it's covered in the law. 10 years for a minimum of 10 years for your AV recordings, and that hopefully, like I said, it doesn't have to come in handy for you, but you know, it'll be very helpful to you to have those should there ever be a question about, you know, the integrity of one of your notarial acts. And if you change your remote vendors, you got to tell us within 10 business days. You know, one of the requirements of the law is that you not just notify us in writing that you're going to do remote notarial acts, but you have to tell us the technologies you're using, technologies you're using. So if you're changing it, you got to tell us so that we can have a current record of what technology you're using as the law requires. Next slide. How do I become an authorized remote notary? Using very similar wording to the emergency, you have to get authorization from us prior to, and that's underlined, or performing an act. You have to submit a completed remote notary notification form via email, same process. We have to put the new form up. If you're already an authorized remote notary that was temporarily authorized, you should have gotten an email from us with an updated form. We'll put the updated form online here shortly. It's very similar, but slightly different from the temporary form. And the most obvious way to tell you if it's the current form is in the lower left corner. There's a footer that says October 1st, 2020, or effective October 1st, 2020. So you'll want to get those forms in advance. Of course, there's a little snag right now. We don't have a bunch of approved RON vendors yet. We're waiting on responses. But as that list gets put together, you'll be able to pick off that list. My guess is the ones that Mike mentioned are, I couldn't see a scenario where they don't, you know, seek to be an authorized RON vendor in Maryland, but you know, I guess that remains to be seen, but I would suspect that they would want to get in on the action. A notary public's authority to perform remote notarial acts expires with the expiration of your commission. If you expire, you're not a notary anymore, and if you're not a notary anymore, you're not authorized to do remote notarizations either. And you may cancel your authorization by submitting a written notice to us at any time. Just got one yesterday. Somebody temporarily authorized, wanted us to cancel their authorization. Great, just send us a written notification and we'll take you off the list, so to speak. But those are the basics. So how to become an authorized remote notary under the new law will be almost identical to becoming one under the temporary guidance that we put out under the emergency order. So I think that that covers it. I think it's question time, right?
Yes, thank you, Mike Schlein. I know there's a lot of information you kind of just gave out just now, and it can seem a little bit overwhelming. We're a little bit over, so I want to definitely put out our polls for those who are interested in CE credit, and I'm curious to the responses as well. And it should be launching right now. We'll give about 60 seconds. But while people are asking or answering the question of whether themselves or their staff plan on becoming e-notaries, want to just discuss one of the questions that did come out. One of our audience members wanted to get clarification about notarizing, I believe is about jurisdiction and presence regarding notarizing a Maryland document and the signer being out of state. I remember you had mentioned who and the parties need to be physically in Maryland, can be outside of Maryland in a RON session.
So in a RON session, the notary has to be located in Maryland. Signer could be anywhere in the world. They could be, I mean, I guess theoretically they could be on the moon, right? And if that's the case, sign me up. I'm going to go witness that. But the notary has to be in Maryland. That's the only restriction with regards to a RON session, right? Maryland Notary Public only has jurisdiction to act in the state of Maryland. So the notary has to be located in Maryland. Doesn't matter where the signer's at. The only restrictions on where the signer is are related to whether or not the document has some business in the United States. So the signer, the document, the record that's being notarized has to be a matter related to the jurisdiction of the United States, or involving property in the jurisdiction of the United States, or a transaction connected with the United States. So the signer can be anywhere in the world as long as that record that the remote notary is notarizing has something to do with the US, and the notary always has to be in Maryland.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think that's where a lot of people kind of get a little mixed up in terms of, we have the jurisdiction of the I'll call it an e-notary, electronic notary performing the RON, where the signer sits, the actual person executing the signing a document, and ultimately the subject matter of the document as well. So getting back to our poll, I'm going to go ahead and close it for now. It looks like everybody has more or less voted. I'll share you with the results currently. Looks like we kind of still have a mixed bag, so similar to what we had before, but it looks like more people are still thinking yes, they are going to become e-notaries and trending that direction. There is a good fair amount of people that said, hey, we're still in the research process, which is totally fine as well. I appreciate your participation there.
One other way to, as I'm thinking about it, to explain the jurisdictional, whereas if you're doing a RON, the signer, whether they're in Maryland, it's basically like they're traveling to Maryland to have something notarized virtually, right? So it's just the same as somebody living in another state that's maybe on vacation here in Maryland and something has to be notarized. They find a Maryland notary to do it. That's essentially what RON is doing, but in the electronic and virtual sense. That's another way to look at it to help you remember who has to be where. They're kind of traveling to the Maryland notary here in Maryland, but doing it online.
I think that's a good way to think about it as well. I mean, we're not changing how notaries, let me rephrase that. We're not changing the process in which notaries are acting, in terms of, verifying the person, ID analysis. We're just, and ultimately, writing they're signing their names and the certificate and the short form of it all. But we are changing the format essentially. And with any format into the digital world, you need to have it translate into that environment. So I think part of it is just, if you're starting your research now, is I I'd highly recommend getting a demo from a RON vendor, asking the questions and trying to relate, okay, what are my processes currently as a notary? What would I normally do face-to-face with someone? And how does that translate into this digital world? What does that look like there? So I think that's a wonderful way to think about it. And let me see here. What other questions we have?
Anshi, before we get into that, just a couple, if I can speak to some of the practical things that we've seen as we've launched our RON utilization in working with platforms. A couple things. One, while the law may say regular notaries can rely on personal knowledge, these RON vendors will want you, even if you knew it was a next door neighbor that you did a closing, they're going to want you to go through their process. So you're going to have to go through that identification process. It's built into their system, and that's not going to change.
And Mike, if you don't mind me jumping in too, and I would even say, we tell people all the time, yeah, personal knowledge is a way of identifying somebody, but even in the traditional notary world, I don't really care if you know them really well or not. I'm going to make my brother give me identification because I want the record. I want the record to prove that he came before me. And it's much easier to prove that if you have identification information that you wrote in your book to verify that. It's a great point, Mike.
Great, thank you. And you have to understand, when you start talking to your RON vendor, if you're already doing RONs or you're getting ready to talk to them, make sure you talk to them about the things that are going on in Maryland. Yes, while we have this model legislation and we've used a large majority of our new legislation to be modeled after that, you have to understand these vendors in the infancy of this business and them being swarmed under in 6 months, they're still digging out, and they have to deal with 50 different states and a couple different territories who have slight variations. What we've discovered is, at least with Notarize, some vendors will require you to use their notaries as they launch, because Maryland's, we're not in that law stage. So while we've been doing this, we've had to use notaries from Florida or Texas or other states that have been approved. As we get past October 1st, some of these vendors will allow you to control the entire process and be the notary and basically use their technology, and some won't. So make sure you ask those questions. That's a really important question, because as we've been going through educating some of the vendors over the years about our business, and they've been learning about our business, they thought that they wanted to control it. We said, no, it's really important for us as title agents, for us to be able to control the entire process. And so that has been developed in the technology. Some of these companies are farther along with that capability, and some aren't in a position to do that. So make sure you ask those questions. Those are pretty critical to have your service levels that you want to keep up.
Great points there, Mike. Mike Ridgway, I appreciate you doing that. I know you have extensive experience with these vendors and working with them. Looks like a few more questions have come in that time. One audience member asks, can we put more than one vendor on the notary notification form if we're going to try several platforms before deciding on one or more? Any issues with that, Michael Schlein?
No issue with that. You can put as many on there as you want. You may have to write off the line a little bit what the vendor is, but we had that even during the emergency. We just kind of had people that were experimenting with a bunch of different vendors, so they listed everybody, and that's totally fine to do that. You can have multiple vendors if you're a remote notary.
Wonderful,
and
wonderful.
The other thing too, one other way to tell that's more than okay is when it talks about electronic journaling. Your journal, if you could even theoretically have more than one electronic journals. We talked about you have to, if you do both electronic and paper, you have to have a paper journal and an electronic journal. But if your journal is tied into your RON vendor and using their platform, you could theoretically have more than one electronic journal, and that's okay because you have more than one RON vendor.
Very good. Very good. Another question we have, I know we're over right now, but I guess if you guys are okay staying on for a little while, I know there's going to be a lot of questions about this. Another audience member asked, doesn't it make sense to just use the vendor's notary? Is there an extra cost? And I can start off with that. I think that a platform, a RON vendor who has the capability of you being the notary, your staff personally being a notary, I'm thinking as a title agency, your staff being a notary, and also having their own, the vendor staff be e-notaries or qualified e-notaries perform, gives you flexibility. So for example, when Ron first started, I think that the biggest selling point was, well, if you've got kids, you don't have to take an hour off of work, pick up the kids, and then go to the office and do that. We can do this all remotely. You can do it from the comforts of your living room on your couch, if you will. That was the big sell. And then COVID hit and said, okay, well, now you kind of have to do this because we can't have you physically here. We can't have 6 feet apart, all that jazz. But I think it does make sense to use a vendor and notary in some applications. I know in the title company I was previously employed at, we had that. We had the ability to do after hours notary where we didn't have to have our own labor force do that as well and just do the vendor. So having that there. Now, as to the extra cost, it all depends on the vendor and how their business model works. I know some vendors have ancillary costs they add on, and some just say, nope, notary is a notary is a notary. Here it goes. So anything, Mike Ridgway, if you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I'm a control freak and for my customer service, and I would highly recommend that you try and be in a position as a closing agent to control this. Again, you have to remember that these Ron portals are drinking from a fire hose, and they have been for 6 months, and they're trying to ramp up their companies, and they're trying to train people and bring notaries on. And the notary from Texas may not know all the things that they should know about Maryland. And I just say, there's a variance in the levels of the notaries that we're using and outsourcing. So I would strongly recommend that you try and control that process, both for the benefit of the customer and for your benefit as the provider. That's just my personal opinion.
No, that's great. Thank you for adding that. Our next question comes from another audience member here. Is there a specific provision in the Ron enabling legislation that expands the authority of a Maryland notary to take the acknowledgement of a person that is located out of state? I know we're putting you on the spot, Michael Schlein.
That's all right. I've read this incoming law way more than I care to admit. So you're not going to see something that specifically says it that way, right? So you are a notary, you obviously have the power to administer an acknowledgement. That is one of your authorities you have today, and that's an authority you'll have after October 1st. That doesn't change. Can you take the acknowledgement of somebody out of state? Absolutely you can, because again, doesn't matter where the person requesting the notarial act is located. The bottom line is, if you, the remote notary, are located in Maryland, this transaction is occurring in Maryland, and remotely, digitally through the internet, but the transactions occurring in Maryland, just like you could administer an acknowledgement to somebody standing physically before you in Maryland, regardless of where they're from. So you won't see it spelled out in that exact way, but of course you can do an acknowledgement. And as one of the things we talked about was, where's the person requesting the notarial act at? Doesn't matter where they're at, you can do it. I'm gonna try to find real quick. There's a section that talks about notarial acts and out of state. But yeah, the answer to the question is, yeah, you can do that.
But Mike, would you have to then use if basically if you're doing it remotely, then don't you have to use the remote technology of one of the Ron vendors?
Yeah, you would. If you're doing it remotely, you'd have to use the technology of a Ron vendor. So, and you, the Maryland, are always located in Maryland. So on that certificate, it's always going to say state of Maryland, county of, wherever you're physically at the time. Acknowledged before me this blank day, 17th day of September 2020 by, Michael Schlein. And you'll affix your seal just like any other notarization you're doing in person.
All right.
Relating to digital certificates, the law says you have to have a digital certificate. Our experience with Notarize, and I'm sure the other Ron vendors will do this, they will help you create that. They're going to charge a fee, but understand, I think they'll probably charge a design fee, and then they'll charge a fee for you to obtain it. But it is your digital certificate. If you're going to They will help you do it. It's yours. You have to deliver that to them. They will help deliver that so that you can function within their portal. But understand that's an extra step and an extra cost that you have to go through. You can probably go out and find it somewhere else. I would just highly recommend you work with your RON vendor for that. And
I would even say too, on top of the digital certificates, digital seals, digital signatures, you get your digital certificate for your signature. If you're hooking up with a RON vendor, I would say that your digital signature that you're going to use, make it an image of your actual signature. Somebody had just reached out to us recently. I guess they needed a record authenticated at a particular clerk's office, and this particular clerk's office apparently compares the signature on the notarization to that in their book when you take your oath of office and get sworn in, and they said, well, it's not the same signature. I can't authenticate it. So if you're going to use an electronic signature, I would say try to use an image of your signature. That's just that never even thought about that, but we're gonna get a lot of questions in the next 6 months that we wouldn't even have dreamed of thinking about, and that's just one as it popped into my mind as you're talking about digital certificates and getting it through your RON vendor. Just use an image of your actual signature, save yourself the worry. I don't know if that's every clerk's office, because I don't think every clerk's office is that detailed or micro in their level of examination of a notarization they have to authenticate for various reasons. I don't know that land records is really the reason they're doing that. It's usually people that need something to be used overseas and they have to authenticate the notarization for international use. But just thinking ahead, I wanted to throw that out there while it popped into my mind from what Mike had said.
Alrighty, well, we're definitely over time, and I appreciate everybody's attendance here. We'll leave it up to one last question, and then we'll call it. For those who are seeking CE credit, no, you don't have to stay till the total end. So sorry if you were trying to get out of here, but that's totally fine. We have you down. And the last question comes from Robert Moses in our audience. Is the time and date of the notarization, the electronic notarization, determined by where the notary is or where the signer is? And a sub question, what if you are in Maryland, the e-notary is in Maryland, and the signer is in Australia? I think I have an idea to the answer to that question. That is a highly technical question. And I think that has to do with a little bit of the technology on the side of things. The documents alone, they are tamper-proof, as we discussed earlier. And if someone does try, they have an evidence seal so that you can see if it has been tampered. But underneath that document, beneath the face value of what you see in terms of the deed or whatever the signature, things like that, there's a lot of metadata that's being collected. That goes down to the time, and that goes to the specific question, the IP address of all entities in that system. And there's a lot of other technical things, the different ways that this document is being passed back and forth, we'll say, between signer and notary, things like that. That's all logged in. So there's a lot of that metadata behind it. And I believe most of the RON vendors, when they talk about time, I think they're both recording local time, but they're also recording, I believe it's called UTC time. I think that's also what the pilots use in terms of having a global time zone as well. So I think that the short answer is yes, it records everything, both times, because they want to be in sync with each other. But also, I think they also adhere to this UTC time as well. But that's a great question to ask any RON vendor as well. Say, hey, you're talking about a time. What are your, go deep into that, because they should definitely be able to answer it. Mike, any addition to that?
I'll say that's a great question, Bob. I would say we need to know that, because if we're doing a closing and the lender requires a document to be signed and notarized on September 17th, and they're over in Australia and it's September 18th, what time controls, I would think that we would be able to use the time that we are locally. As Michael says, that person is presenting themselves in Maryland virtually. Yep. And so we should be able, I would think the laws would interpret it that that document was signed on September 17th at the time that the digital notarial certificate was affixed by the Maryland notary. But we'll see. I would think that would be the presumption.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. In the law, the only time and date come up are with regards to making the record in the notary's journal. And all it says is, each entry should be made contemporaneously with the performance of the Notarial Act and contain the following information. The first piece of information is the date and time the Notarial Act was performed. So if you're a Maryland notary and you're making the record in your journal, I'd be putting the time and date it is in Maryland. It's currently 11:26 a.m. on Thursday, September the 17th. That's the time and date I'm recording this Notarial Act having occurred, because, like Mike said, and, I mentioned, they're really traveling to Maryland in a virtual sense, not, when you're doing raw, not in a physical sense. They may happen to be here too. But the time and date that I would care about as a regulator would be the time and date in Maryland. The person's from Australia, I can do the math if I really need to figure that out, and that matters. But date and time it occurred, if you're a Maryland notary, I would pick the Maryland date and time. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you to everybody in the audience that has stuck around to watch the end of this. We look forward to providing more educational opportunities in the future. If you have any questions, feel free to contact these gentlemen directly, or your security title representative, your state or agency managers will be able to help. And this is a journey we're all on. So nothing here is set in stone. I guess the law is kind of set in stone, but that can be changed.
Subject to interpretation.
Exactly. You took the words right out of my mouth. Yes, exactly. And this is all going to be a little bit amoebic until we really have it hammered down. And the technology also will come with it as well. So appreciate your time, guys. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Take care.